Hello and welcome to MedCity's Invest Digital Health Conference. My name is Orundhati Parmar and I'm the editor-in-chief of MedCity News. As of the first half of 2021, digital health companies have raked in an eye-popping $14.7 billion. But where's the money actually going? Is it in telemedicine? Is it in RPM tools? Is it in operational efficiency, pair efficiencies? Is it in AI? And is it in patient engagement? To answer that question, we have to turn to our expert panel here today. The session will be moderated by Chitra Naubath, and we have Francisco Jimenez, Christopher McFadden, and Dina Shakir. So Chitra is the global head of health assurance and innovation at General Catalyst. She leads strategic partnerships and the expansion and execution of the firm's health assurance thesis. Chitra's unique multi-industry and multidisciplinary expertise powers her role as a business builder across General Catalyst and its portfolio companies. She has her certified public accountant designation and is a graduate of Harvard Business School and University of Toronto. Chitra has been involved in various leadership and philanthropic activities, such as serving as an adjunct professor at Rutgers Business School, the Executive Leadership Council, and a team leader of researchers for a social competitiveness index for the World Economic Forum. Welcome to you, Chitra. Francisco Jimenez is partner at 8VC. He focuses on bio-IT, health IT, and enterprise AI investments. Previously, he was a resident data scientist at Formation 8 Partners, where he worked with portfolio companies to strategize, prototype, and recruit for data products. He was the founder of Catinus Science, a data science consulting and recruiting firm that used an apprenticeship model to help early-stage companies build data science teams. Francisco received his PhD from Stanford in biomedical informatics, where he was a Ruth L. Kirchstein Fellow. His research focused on clinical decision support for radiology, which won him the Martin Epstein Award for Best Paper at the American Medical Informatics Association in 2014. Prior to that, he got his BS in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley while doing research in Parkinson's disease at UCSF. Welcome to you, Francisco. Christopher McFadden is the managing editor at KKR Credit. Chris joined KKR in 2018 and is focused on healthcare investing. He works closely with private markets healthcare team to originate and execute a broad range of credit investment and third-party capital market opportunities. Prior to joining KKR, Chris was a senior advisor for Ethereum Capital Management. Previously, he was a partner at Health Evolution Partners and a managing director at Goldman Sachs, where he was a member of the America's Special Situations Group focused on healthcare investing. Chris holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Richmond and is a chartered financial analyst. Welcome to you, Chris. Dina Shakir is partner at Lux Capital. She is particularly interested in contrarian and underdog founders building ambitious companies in digital health. She sits on the boards of companies including H1, Adine, Allstripes, A-Life Health, Steady MD, and Shiru. Prior to joining Lux, she was a partner at Google Ventures, led partnerships for moonshot products at Google, and directed social impact investments at google.org. She was also a presidential management fellow in the Obama administration, where she worked in Secretary Clinton's office and at USAID on programs supporting global entrepreneurship. The first generation daughter of Iraqi immigrants, Dina self-funded her way through college at Harvard and Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. Welcome to you, Dina. Before I turn over to Chitra to begin the session, I wanted to tell the audience that feel free to put questions in the chat, and Chitra is going to try to weave in the questions where appropriate. So over to you, Chitra.
Thank you so much. Good day to everyone, to our viewers and listeners. Thanks so much for taking the time to participate in this conversation. And Francisco, Dina, Chris, shall we dive in here?
Let's do it.
Look forward.
So let's start off with having each of you share a little bit of the context on your firm, areas in healthcare where you invest, as well as some of the company stages that you focus on. Chris, let's start with you.
Sure, happy to. Good morning, and Thanks for including me and for MedCity for hosting this event and to the sponsor. So KKR was founded in 1976. Today, we're a multi-asset class investment firm, which includes private equity, growth equity, credit, and infrastructure. We manage a little over $400 billion of assets globally, which is Asia for us, North America, and Europe. And have been focused, principally around healthcare across three asset classes: our U.S. Private equity business, our growth equity healthcare fund, and our credit vehicles. And have tried to stay active in all markets except venture, which is not an area or a class of investment or stage where we have historically had a footprint.
Francisco?
Great. So I'm a partner at 8VC. 8VC is a venture capital firm with about $5 billion in assets under management. We're currently investing out of our fourth vehicle, which is two vehicles, a $640 million traditional venture fund that invests in seed, Series A and Series B, and then a late stage opportunities fund, which is about $800 million to sort of follow on to sort of our winners, but also kind of do and move into growth investing in the later stages. The way so besides being a generalist fund, I think the principle has always been how do sort of the tools of digitization, computation, and whatnot change older enterprise industries. The way we think about that in healthcare is about 30% of it is in what we call bio IT. That's sort of life sciences through sort of traditional drug discovery and therapeutics through things that we view as the sort of infrastructure of pharma. And so that can be clinical trials, that can be analytics, even biomanufacturing. And that bleeds over into our health IT focus, which is about 10 to 15% of our fund, which is really sort of better care delivery and patient services. Though the distance between those things kind of gets gray when we start to think about sort of novel drug discovery through novel delivery mechanisms. And so that's really kind of been how we think about the world and using sort of all the tools of technology today to kind of provide new drugs, new drug interactions with patients.
And Francisco, the stages for the
so yeah, the main fund is seed, Series A and Series B, and then we have the late stage fund. So it's kind of everything in the private landscape. I think our sweet spot is Series A, but we've done first money into several companies. We've helped build companies from the ground up, and then done a lot of late stage investing.
And before we go to Dina, Chris, if we can dip back to you, you talked about your three funds. If you could maybe double click on that a little bit in terms of a little bit more color of the differences as well as the stages of company.
Yeah, so I would characterize it as all commercial stage, ranging from growth stage businesses that might have a roll-up characteristic, but still a proven commercial and clinical model, and in many cases, if not all cases, EBITDA positive through large cap buyouts from our private equity business. And then we have a private financing business, which is about $70 billion of AUM, where we finance both existing issuers as well as new sponsor-led transactions.
Dina, yourself?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I'm a partner at Lux Capital. We are a multi-stage venture capital fund with 4 billion AUM. We do everything from first capital in and incubation all the way through growth, and are investing out of our seventh venture fund, which is a $675 million fund, and our third total opportunity fund, which is an $800 million vehicle. I have made about a dozen investments since joining, mostly focused on health tech, although we are all generalists, and I've done a little bit in ed tech and fintech as well. We generally lead and prefer to lead on the venture side, usually seed to Series B, and can participate and sometimes lead or co-lead on the growth side as well, which we recently did with Maven in the women's health space.
And Dina, what are some of the specific areas, thesis that are getting a higher share of your focus of your investment dollars?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we like to invest in what we call matter that matters. And healthcare has been a big part of our focus since the beginning. So we've done surgical robots like Oris. We've done R&D software like Benchling and H1 and Allstripes on the real world evidence side. We like to look for sort of the plumbing, that the picks and shovels that are laying the infrastructure for the digital health transformation, or in other industries, other types of digital transformation. So we look for big markets, large companies, generational companies, contrarian entrepreneurs, and we're not shy of hardware or software or consumer or enterprise, really quite flexible.
And when it comes to that you just shared, is there a certain segmentation or the way that you think about the value chain? Because, like, for example, at General Catalyst, the way in which we invest, we think about with health assurance, we think about core tech, data and AI, workforce transformation, health assurance services, risk and payments, consumer experiences. That's a little bit of the landscape of how we think about the world. Do you have your own way that you dissect the healthcare value chain?
Yes, and we have quite a few co-investments with you all as well, including Camure, Nintendo, and others. So those are some of the frameworks, but we think about the value chain, starting from the earliest days of clinical research. And so, how can we use software and technology to catalyze innovation, to accelerate things like vaccine developments in the future, to improve diversity and inclusion, not only in the patient set, but also in areas like rare disease, and identifying KOLs who are underrepresented as well. So starting kind of from that stage, and then all the way through companies like Variant in our portfolio that are looking at genetic data sets from all over the world and identifying outliers there. On the care delivery side, companies like Maven and SteadyMD that are not only providing virtual care at scale, but also focused on quality, on personalization, and on entering new markets. And then, as I mentioned, of course, we have a number of companies as well in the hardware space. So really a wide range in everything from the earliest days of discovering innovation all the way through the patient experience and beyond.
Francisco?
Yeah, I think we always have an investor crush on Lux, and so it's not a significant difference in how we think about the world. Maybe I'll just segment it in a slightly different terminology, but I think I like to think of it in how we view it as like the application layer and the infrastructure layer for healthcare. And so one thing that I studied a lot in my PhD was AI and radiology, right? And you always we know we can do AI in radiology. We know we have images, we know we have output labels, we know we can do some kind of, predictions therein, computer-aided diagnosis and whatnot. And really it's the distribution and ability to deploy these kinds of applications using, AI and radiology as an example, that doesn't really lend itself well to the sort of existing infrastructure. So sometimes you're like, great, I can create all these deep learning models. I can create these sort of interesting workflow automation tools. But sometimes we actually just have to build the infrastructure to be able to deploy that. And so you start at the application layer, you move into the infrastructure layer. And so, for example, with radiology, where one of our companies, Serona, is rebuilding sort of how radiology health IT works. Or on the flip side, we started investing in these really interesting infrastructure companies. Like Resilience for biomanufacturing, or Tilda for sort of clinical trials recruiting and management. And then once you enable that, you start thinking, what new world have we enabled such that we can invest in the application layer, right? So if we have a clinical trials, like decentralized clinical trials platforms, if you squint, pharma and a clinical trial is kind of like an IDN, right? Like it's a system that manages patient care that you can quickly translate because it's already got the hooks and integrations into the healthcare system to deploy. And so that's kind of my segmentation there. And then we think about this in all the sort of aspects, like we said, from academic R&D all the way through sort of like consumer patient delivery, sort of indication specific applications, for things like depression, for things like anxiety, for menopause treatment with EverNow. And all of these, we kind of just think about these difficult to manage patient indications and go at that consumer end. So, yeah.
And I was just going to build on that for a second, because I think Francisco provides a really elegant description of a great use case, right, for the use of AI in radiology, except that if you sort of abstract to what's happening in clinical practice, notwithstanding, there are many, I think, thoughtful ways to approach it, including what IBM's tried to do with Watson. There's little to no adoption, right? And I think that gets to kind of the crux of a lot of the larger digital health conversation, at least from my vantage point. It's not, is there the scientific acumen to create these models? It's not that there's dollars to support them. There's not even an inability to get to pilot sort of demonstrations of effectiveness. The challenge is crossing the classic chasm so that payers, regulators, and community providers want to and know how to use the technology that's being made available to them. And so, to me, that's an important larger question. It's not meant to be negative or unsupportive of the role of digital health. We've invested in digital health and see lots of applications for it, but I think it speaks to the larger truth to date, which is all the energy at early stages have not translated yet as linearly into clinical practice, and therefore meeting total TAM sort of opportunities as perhaps everyone has been hoping for.
Dina, Francisco, any thoughts on what Chris just shared?
I agree. And so sometimes we're just like, how do we build for that future, which is why we moved into the infrastructure investing. Or sometimes it's like, let's just change the definition of digital health so it works, right? And so it's like anything where, computers meet medicine,
Right.
Great. And so if you think about that, there's plenty of companies like CityBlock Health or care services and delivery companies where, maybe we don't have like fancy AI, but even just the care coordination to manage all the complexity of all these different services and deploying them to people, where computation is necessary but not sufficient for success. Yeah. Is that digital health? I don't know. You couldn't do it without computers, but it's not what we think of in terms of a patient engaging with an app to kind of get treatment.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Francisco. I think if you look at the last several decades of innovation in, take your term of choice, digital health, maybe some called it healthcare IT, maybe it's health tech. You'll see that it's not always the innovation itself that it actually unlocks scale, right? And I say that as a partner at a deep tech firm where we certainly love to look for fantastic breakthrough and defensible innovation. But when it comes to this market, we've realized that a lot of it is also about the moment. It's very much about timing. It's about team, and it's about go to market. And those are certainly characteristics that can make any company successful. But I think particularly in my experience in this industry, that's a lot of it. CityBlock is an excellent example. Medicaid is a very, very hard market to innovate in. And certainly we have much more penetration of smartphone and connectivity and all of that. But at the end of the day, you need to be meeting patients where they are. And that's not necessarily always through innovation. And we all know providers in particular don't like adopting new technologies. So we need to be able to work within the confines and the constructs of existing platforms.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Dina. Listen, I think the role of managed Medicaid in 40 plus states now has been just a complete game changer, right? In terms of how you find a partner aligned and a distribution channel to reach a wide number of providers and patients. I think what we try to step back on, and again, we live in a slightly different phase or stage of some of this innovation, but have tons of respect for a lot of the great ideas and products that are coming out of it is, regardless of payer, commercial, health plan, self-insured, governmental, the larger picture, I think we could all agree, is how do I increase the yield on healthcare spending, right? And you can define yield a lot of different ways, access, care, outcomes, but let's just call it yield for a second. And then there are a number of necessary steps, right? You have to have some level of scale at the provider level to deploy and employ these technologies. you have to have powerful technology that kind of changes the cost curve or the patient outcome. Hopefully you have a payment mechanism that reinforces and incents that behavior, and then you get care delivery and outcomes at the end that kind of help sort of reinforce it. And so I think technology, as somebody said a moment ago, is critically important in whatever form it comes, to Francisco's point. But it's also, sort of as it's also a component of the larger transition, which is how do we increase value or yield on healthcare spend, which I think will be the defining sort of principle for the rest of our investing careers, as far as I can tell.
And Chris, you say a key word there, yield, ROI, return on investment, of which all of our firms, venture capital and private equity, are focused on. But at your point in the value chain, which is different than venture capital, where then are you focused in terms of getting your investment dollars? What's exciting you right now?
Yeah, I think keying on that, we are trying to build in the delivery context, delivery organizations that can really operate at scale, right? So, that starts with some level of provider integration. That can be equity integration, that can be MSO integration, that can be IDN organized integration. But if you don't have some cohesive shared services layers that connect providers in a region or in a specialty, it's hard. And there are lots of investment strategies that are trying to accomplish that. You have to have connectivity and analytics, right? And that's a very wide aperture set of concept, but you have to be able to take the scale and convert it into information that informs all phases of care delivery, payment, patient management, patient engagement, and then what's happening on payment reform. As I said, in one regard, that's helping providers, whether it's RCM or adjuncts of RCM, to optimize the payments they're receiving, whether those are bundled payments, capitated payments, or fee-for-service payments. It's also providing tool sets for health plans to know how to measure and manage those providers in their networks, right? So that's a bit of a two-sided market. And some groups cross over, but more often you find them focusing on one end of that transaction set or the other. So that's certainly one, large thematic focus for us. I'd say another, thematic focus, which is maybe a little less sexy, but I think, likewise kind of interesting, is what's happening, across the physical supply chain, taking into account both the needs of providers, but what's happening upstream in terms of manufacturing capacity, integrity and security of product, and the like. And so that's certainly another area where we're spending a bit of time.
And I just want to weave in a question from the chat, which pertains to something each of you had touched on. So this question is from Max, and he says, how are you thinking about valuation in the context of the influx of health funds, crossover dollars into healthcare, and what's the end game? Chris, if you want to start, and then we can go to Francisco after. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll defer to Francisco and my other panel colleagues. They're probably closer to the ground on some of the, the more innovative technologies. But certainly in our world, it's all true, right? We're seeing crossover technology funds coming into healthcare. You've got, large traditional LPs that are now, becoming direct investors in businesses and in take private transactions. So, there's tons of capital floating around, and I think it requires, domain expertise to have an edge with leadership teams, an edge in terms of having conviction on diligence and on your thesis, and ultimately, being able to tolerate an entry multiple that might be a little uncomfortable, but knowing how to create value for the business once you have ownership to really make sure you're achieving your target exit returns.
Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, this is okay. So it's always kind of exciting when you're like an early stage investor and some big, hedge fund or crossover fund comes in and marks you up an enormous amount with it and super capitalizes the company. So I can't, I don't think anybody's necessarily complaining from our perspective. So the things that I worry about or think about in that context is their incentive structures, I think, have been that they don't need as much of a return multiple that like a VC does. You don't need to get your 10 to 100x or whatever sort of arbitrarily large number of VC claims they need to get on a return. And I think that's the brilliance of their math, is just like, if I just need to get a 3x return, I can afford to pay up and move downstream. And I think where they're also getting very clever is, especially in sort of like managed care settings or whatever, you just kind of see as patient populations grow, you kind of know intrinsically in LTV, and these are very sticky, revenue sources. And so you're like, we can kind of model this out very thoughtfully, in essentially diligence by spreadsheet, right? And when you have that, I think that you could argue this is a market efficiency. Like, these people understand that there are good returns for them at a lower hurdle rate, and then it also helps us support our companies and get them well funded. The only concern I have here is when those investments are not based on, say, any kind of fundamentals, but rather the sort of exuberance and excitement about the technology itself. Because sometimes a little bit of scarcity helps a startup focus and figure itself out. And then being overcapitalized very early, especially if you haven't really started to achieve a growth trajectory, allows you to continue making mistakes or not solving for sort of crucial mistakes, which is sometimes you kind of see, and then it just puts you in a difficult position, say as a board member, to say we should fix this thing. And they're like, why? We have so much money and we're still kind of growing and things look good. And so I think that's the only difficulty here that I really kind of experience on a more regular basis. But broadly, I think the interest here is important. It's valuable to have them come down.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all very, very good points. As we think about, I think, healthcare in particular and the investments that we're making, it's almost become trite to say that this is unprecedented times. I hate to even use that word anymore, but truly, for those of us that have been, building and or investing in healthcare for years now, I think it's become clear that some of these innovations that might have been nice to have propelled into permanence, and that is unlocking some value, a hell of a lot of value, I think, that we have yet to even see. Things move slowly, especially in the payer world and health systems. And so, while it feels like we've been in this pandemic forever, it will take some time for us to really see what the long-term implications in terms of creating real value for these companies means, especially for those that are, collaborating with the key stakeholders here. So although these valuations are high, and 100%, Francisco, agree with you on some of the potentially concerning dynamics around, diligence and or incentives. That being said, I still believe that we are entering at an absolutely critical inflection point, and that there will be a tremendous amount of value ahead.
I want to get into some of the areas that you talked about where you all are focused, and in this kind of context, which is there's some research which shows that there's a shift in profit pools leading to growth, specifically in the areas of pre-acute, medical devices, data and analytics, which you've all talked about, especially you, Chris, software and platforms. If each of you could give some ideas in terms of opportunities in these areas. And Francisco, let's start with you.
Sorry, just writing it down. I can't speak as much to medical devices, so maybe, but data and analytics is kind of our bread and butter. This is what we think about day in and day out. I think a lot about, so we actually have a sort of data infrastructure investing arm, which kind of invests in sort of very like bread and butter, like databases, like next gen OLTP databases in the cloud and sort of metadata stores and whatnot. We're actually seeing those get a lot of adoption in these kind of digital transformations and creating data lakes, right? So it's not really, even healthcare specific. There's no healthcare in the diligence. It's just that we're starting to see a lot of really large entities, both healthcare services entities and pharma entities, who have incredibly siloed data sets. And it's kind of the standard, story you tell about banks or other sort of large governmental institutions. And they need to buy sort of, basic database infrastructure that allows for this and is cloud native. Then you start thinking about sort of semantic aware databases that manage sort of complex data. So like a binary, like radiology is like a DICOM file, is a binary blob with metadata on top of it, or sequencing data or EEG data, like all of these signal datas with metadata stores, and you actually need to have the understanding of the metadata to sort of structure it, and then the discoverability, observability, and then all of the appropriate sort of processing and computation questions over it for building a QMS or sort of regulatory filings, or building things in sort of a standardized way for endpoint products. Then we start thinking about like, what are the applications here? So things like Unlearn is doing digital twins to basically model what a placebo group in a trial is. And that's unbelievably cool. And so we're just thinking about this from basic databases all the way up through, what we can do with data. And I think we just get inbound from both pharma and healthcare services all the time saying, like, what should our goals be? And honestly, the one answer I always give them is, have you solved your data integration problems first? Have you actually, defragmented your silos? And once you start doing that, you don't need AI, you just need a clever join to solve most of the problems in healthcare. And then once we get to the point where we need AI, I think we get really excited. And that's kind of how I think about the software and the platform systems as well, is what's your API layer, interoperability layers. We've talked about Commure a little bit, but just sitting on top of the EMR itself to actually build applications. And these are all the infrastructure questions I have. I get so excited when you think about the applications and what the future can have in store, but really it's, where's the infrastructure today, what's being built today, and then we can start to parse out where we should be deploying this in this sort of application side.
Gina?
Yeah, I not much to add there. I agree with Francisco, and certainly on some of our companies there. I will say, while maybe 5 years ago, the idea of API integration and interoperability and so on was, well, not just the idea, but the actual execution of it was not necessarily commoditized. It is something now that can happen at scale. And again, that's where the opportunities to invest in companies that are really going to move the needle here are really exciting. And data lake, companies like Commure, or digital front door companies like Tendo. At the end of the day, what we're hearing from the health systems, from the pharma companies, from payers, from employers, is that they are exhausted by the sheer proliferation of solutions out there. And so at some point, something's got to give. There's only so many, vendors that customers can have, and it's not in the best interest of the broader sort of population health for all of these solutions to be siloed. And so anything that can kind of connect the dots, and that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be one company, or there has to be further consolidation or oligopization or anything like that. But the companies that are able to connect those dots, I think is where the real value is going to be.
And and on that point, and Francisco and Dina, you both talked about Commure, which is a company, as you all know, the General Catalyst hatched. There's actually a question from the audience tied to this. From Anthony around, what about integrating solutions in EHR workflow to ensure the solution is accessible, actionable, and automated for our clinicians? Your thoughts on that? Francisco, do you want to?
Okay, I can go. I mean, I think that's great. I don't know what else to say. Like, I agree, we should do that. How we do it is always kind of the devil's in the details. I think in terms of data sharing agreements, I think we're hitting within 12 to 18 months, the Cures Act sort of data interoperability becomes, more prevalent or kind of hits its final stage. I think Commure exists simply to build those applications on top of it and kind of be that middleware layer. And that's, why it was started, right? And it kind of plays right into what I'm saying before, is like, we know all these amazing things we could do, but we just need to build that infrastructure first.
I was going to make the point, I don't think the barrier is the technology. I think the barrier is in Madison, Wisconsin, and Kansas City, right? Those are the barriers to getting at least hospital-based EMR connectivity to be state-of-the-art, compared to data exchange in other industries. And certainly there appears to be, increasing regulatory pressure, meaningful use, and other to accomplish that. But it's taken longer than I think anyone imagined, when we started down, this digitization path as a country.
And Chris, your thoughts in terms of what I was mentioning about growth areas in terms of pre-acute medical devices and so forth.
Yeah, I actually think I think the medical device space is gotten to be quite interesting. I think we're coming out of a little bit of a dark winter, which for the last number of years you were sort of working off, sort of the down cycle of a long period of consolidation and incremental innovation in a bunch of implantable sorts of technologies, and then you saw a sharp decline in the amount of M&A that the large med tech companies were doing. And I think it was Dina who mentioned Oris and what's happening in robotics. But I think what's happening in robotics is just really dynamic, moving out of the, kind of the core original intuitive, use case for prostate, moving into interventional pulmonology and some other areas where you have the opportunity not just to expand the addressable market, to grow the number of sites where there's a health economic benefit, but to really get after even more complex disease. And you've seen Stryker and others all begin to make investments here. Full disclosure, I'm a board member for Mauna Kea Technologies, which is doing some visualization work in this space, but I think it's just a small piece of a much larger trend, which is how virtualization in the surgical suite has the potential to continue to grow and be quite influential. And I think that's to me that's really dynamic.
Dina, you made reference to the pandemic and the effect that it's had. And one of the areas it's had a significant effect on people is behavioral health. And there's research which is showing that psychiatric and behavioral health hospitals will experience faster growth of around 6% per year because of things like increased insurance coverage, more favorable federal policy, and rising, unfortunately, rising incidence of substance abuse. How are you thinking about this area? Dina, we can start.
Yeah, I think it is unfortunate, and there's now enough time that we've been able to see some of the data around, as you said, substance abuse, around certainly opioid and other types of addictions, insomnia, sleeping pills, et cetera. And I think a lot of people have thought about this in the context of, well, it's easier to use telehealth, and that seems like a more intuitive platform versus, for example, some sort of interventional surgery that you might need. And to this day, we can't really quite do that through our phone. However, I think there's still a really big opportunity in severe mental illness. And a lot of what we've talked about or seen in terms of these funding rounds and very large and impressive companies has been more around coaching, around non-acute therapy, around social workers and so on, all of which is very important. And there is a massive need for it, particularly for pediatrics, adolescents, underserved populations, Medicaid, et cetera. But I think we have yet to see a big amount of innovation that is more focused on SMIs and those sort of traditionally inpatient type settings. And so I think that's where the real opportunity is. How can we move into not only more access to behavioral health, but actually better quality, right? And I think and so whether it's digital biomarkers, I think there was a recent announcement about Apple innovating in that space for mental health just this week, or whether it's in novel forms of communication technology. If you think about it in the context of the future of work, Zoom, what we're doing right now is replacing us physically being in a conference room and on a panel, and that's great. And we're all over the place now, and we're able to communicate with one another. But the next generation of platforms, and I'm sure Zoom will also innovate in this area as well, will actually make our communication, our collaboration better and more effective. And we're seeing that in other areas. I think healthcare is going to be next.
Dina, you talked about.
I would, if I just could build on that for a second, I couldn't agree with Dina more on two facets of this. I think there has been, and again, understandably, a lot of focus and a lot of investment capital that's gone after the lower acuity end, the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, relative to mental health. And there's a lot of appropriate reasons to do that. But I think, like in many parts of healthcare, you have to figure out where you save real dollars and affect real patient outcomes. And particularly through the middle of this country, where there are virtual behavioral health deserts in the absence of providers to treat patients, there is a really a embarrassing lack of support for people with SMI. And virtual care or telehealth has an important role to play there to fill the gap and solve for the problem. I think you're seeing the public sector begin to respond to it in a material way. And I think you will continue to see that be thematically really important. I think assets or provider organizations who have competency with SMI, I think are going to have some interesting scarcity value, because it's not where the majority of the energy has been focused, because frankly, it's hard. In no other way to say that. I think the other point that I'd make is, and it goes maybe to the inpatient comment you made earlier, in my mind, at least, there's been a really fundamental change in how at least self-insured employers are thinking about mental health as part of a benefit design plan. I think we all recognize that for over a decade, firms like Beacon and Magellan took, behavioral health benefits as a carve out from the traditional health plan, and in many cases, really were there to be utilization managers as opposed to care coordinators and care providers. I think somebody's finally gotten to the CFO at a lot of these large self-insured employers and said, in effect, you're limiting access to behavioral health care services, which inevitably, as some of the actuarial data now tells us, is showing up as higher spend in your medical plan. And you're the ultimate financially responsible party for both sides of the equation. You're really not improving your overall health yield. And so as traditional health plans in the ASO and self-insured market are increasingly reintegrating medical care with behavioral care, you're getting better access combined with reduced stigma and much more improved access to care. And I think that's up and down the continuum from severe inpatient substance abuse and down through, the lower acuity therapy. And I think that's probably a decade-long trend that is going to play through. And it's the reason that mental health has been the number one category for digital health investments, I think, for each of the last, 4 years, because it can play a really differentiated role in figuring out how do we deal with a environment in which the demand for mental health services is increasing for all the reasons we've discussed, but the total number of providers is virtually unchanged, and some 40% of providers take no managed care patients. They're cash only, right? So you've got, huge scarcity issues or supply issues, which again, I think all forms of digital health and technology can do really important work to help close that gap.
I want to also get into a topic, and there's a few things coming through on the chat about consumerization, direct to consumer. Consumer expectations of healthcare are being influenced by other industries. So whether it's Amazon and Google in terms of personalization or ease of use, digital enablement, Stripe for payments, where do you see convergence and influence from other industries on healthcare? Francisco, how about we start with you?
Yeah, so one major investment thesis area we have is sort of indication specific disease management applications. So if you think about, the OGs of this were something like, the Omadas of the world with diabetes, or Livongos of the world with diabetes. But then we're starting to see one of these emerge for some kind of major chronic condition where we have some kind of pharmaceutical intervention, some kind of healthcare, intervention. And what has been surprising to me is, we talk a lot about comorbidities in people in the healthcare system, but usually people have sort of one dominant condition that they would probably pay for or want to focus on to kind of ameliorate their suffering, right? So if we think about, people with treatment-resistant depression, and Mind Bloom is kind of like sort of telehealth ketamine-based therapy, or we think about menopause. We have Ever now kind of doing hormone replacement therapy in addition to provider care, or Sprout for autism, and then like Hims was also like kind of an early version of this for erectile dysfunction and hair loss. All of those companies, right? They have to offer kind of a traditional suite of services, which is, a provider to be able to prescribe these things, some way to follow up on people. possibly prescription intervention, kind of, managing the regulatory landscape they're in, and then, at some point down the road, reimbursement. But a lot of these conditions are so difficult that it's basically people are cash paying just for this. Once we start looking at it that way, all the metrics look like consumer app metrics. It's like LTV to CAC. What's our retention? My favorite number to think about in these companies is what is, the amount of patients that can be managed by a single sort of provider. And actually, that's kind of the magic number I think about a lot. Like one company, I won't mention, the numbers of these because that's kind of like the secret weapon, but like the most amazing one I saw is like a 1 to 6,000 because of all the automation tools that they built in to be able to sort of automate prescription sort of monitoring and patient engagement workflows. But even something like 1 to 50, 1 to 75, this is kind of the number that we think about a lot of providers to sort of patient interactions. And so it's funny, we have like a lot of consumer people coming in saying, oh, great, what's my L7s, what's my engagement metrics, all this stuff. I think that's bringing that mind into it, but then having the solutions provider say, oh, we can solve for these things with these kinds of interventions. It's kind of this nice sort of intersection of, helping physicians actually meet patients where they need to be, but having the metrics to do so, which I think is really exciting.
Dina?
Yeah, I'm not too much to add there. I think we're all in agreement here. We should find some things to argue about.
So let's talk about then biopharma. So in that area, there's tailwinds, whether it's precision medicine or the maturation of digital medicine. There's headwinds like research and development. That productivity there remains poor. There's increased competition for patients in clinical trials like oncology. Your thoughts on biopharma?
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I think this is an area certainly where there has been a lot of dollars put to work, and I think where there's still massive opportunity across the board. There's still so many areas that have yet to benefit from some of the innovation that has been applied to larger cost centers. And so again, without sounding like a squeaky wheel here, the types of software in particular, or tech-enabled service platforms that can accelerate innovation so that we can have another, if we have another pandemic and we need to find a vaccine in record time, that the tools are in place for us to do that and to avoid the next pandemic and to address chronic disease and cancer and so on. And so whether it's platforms like Allstripes that are developing real world evidence communities for rare disease and unlocking treatments there, or solutions like H1 on the clinical research side, or virtualization of clinical trials with Science 37. I think there's still a lot more that can be done, and I'm seeing a lot of crossover as well between some of the companies that had traditionally focused on biopharma and are now looking at health systems and vice versa. So I think that's also going to be an interesting trend coming up next year.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree with everyone's comments that it's an important area, a lot of good things going on. I think we're focused on two pretty durable trends as we have looked at this market. One is that, I'm in San Francisco, and so South San Francisco is certainly a great illustration of this. A lot of incredibly innovative science coming out of university and other settings are getting early stage funding, getting to a phase 1 endpoint. For example, in the past, that would have been the exit, right? Or they would have licensed that compound or technology out to a large biopharma and moved on. But for a variety of market factors, including sort of the change or the redefined clinical pathway under orphan drug status, you're seeing these same organizations be able to fund their way all the way to commercial launch in some cases. And so what that really means, I think, to the part of the point that Dina was making, is that the infrastructure to support those organizations, which is outsourced, virtualized services all across the entire life cycle of product development and into early commercialization, which have historically existed within large biopharma, are now getting real scale as vendors into this very well-funded innovation cohort. And I think there's lots of reasons to believe that that's going to be good for returns on those early stage innovative product companies. And also that you're going to continue to see some really successful companies grow and grow profitably supporting those organizations. I think the second one, which is in many ways the flip side of the coin, is that health plans and their customers, large self-insured employers, are struggling mightily with the cost for some of these most specific drug therapies, whether it's immunotherapy and cancer or some of the orphan drug status with $50, $100, $200,000 a year sorts of costs. And how can you be certain and say with precision, pardon the pun, that is going to be effective for that particular patient or their loved one or their child, and that you're going through the appropriate screening, not to deny care, but just to be certain that they are the right match. And so the precision area, not just for drug development, but for pairing and paying for those approved products once they get into practice, that will continue to I think be an area of enormous focus because frankly, you're really breaking the curve when you think about the number of products that meet that cost profile and the total impact on whatever funding source you think is going to be responsible for those payments, because the traditional copay deductible sorts of mechanics just don't work, right? Not at the number, the quantum of product cost we're describing. And so, other value-based tools are going to continue to be in high demand.
Francisco?
I feel like we could just do an entirely separate panel on this topic alone. I think I agree with the vision Chris has provided, that biotechs need to go the distance. If you look at the amount of biotechs we have today, all kind of chasing sort of overlapping indications, and the traditional model of M&A to pharma, there's no, it's a pigeonhole principle problem. We don't have enough pharmas to acquire the biotechs that we're creating, and all these biotechs have really amazing science behind them. One thing we think about a lot is like the single most disruptive thing we can be doing as investors is building more resources to help biotechs commercialize their own drugs, for a couple of reasons. One, and first and foremost, is like if we leave it to pharma for M&A, that effectively means we have like 100 CSOs determining which diseases we're going to cure for the next decade, right? What's on my shopping list? How much am I going to pay? These are the diseases we're going to cure. That's insane. And especially when you're thinking about, we can only do an M&A when we're going to think about sort of multi-billion-dollar drugs, it kind of leaves these small orphan drugs by the wayside. And so then what you do is you go through an orphan drug designation to kind of, get a fast approval and hope for label expansion, or just prove out the platform to be able to do sort of follow on drugs here. But an orphan indication might only be $100 million. And if it's like a small molecule drug, that's a 95% profit margin. If that was a SaaS company, it would be a $5 billion company. And we just can't do that because we don't allow or create the infrastructure and frameworks for these people to be able to commercialize these drugs. And so you have to start thinking about, how do you give them the tools for the clinical trials, for biomanufacturing, for commercialization? All of these become digital tools. What I think is most interesting there is if we build this out, which we're doing, like we built out a biomanufacturing company, Resilience, we have clinical trial recruiting companies, and I know there's a ton of them, think about a lot of tools for commercialization, is that when a pharma runs a clinical trial, it's not just doing a clinical trial for a drug. Frequently, it's a clinical trial for a technology to bring that drug. Think about a companion diagnostic, what Path AI is doing for AI and pathology. Or even when we start thinking about Science 37 or Tilda or these decentralized clinical trial systems, they're rebuilding a healthcare infrastructure without the burdens of reimbursement because they're just getting paid from pharma. It's like a blue sky way to build this up that you can actually deploy to patient care services because they've been there since the beginning for these drugs. And so that's where I get really excited. I think our North Star internally has been, what has AWS done for enterprise SaaS? It's really dropped the cost such that you can do a Series A for $10 million, right? How do we make that possible in biopharma such that we can do the $10 million Series A so that drug costs don't need to be so high and we can cure smaller orphan diseases and have this decentralized model?
So great segue.
Yeah, I was going to agree. I think Francisco makes some excellent points, and in full agreement. I was just going to be a little cynical at the end and say I worry that pricing is less about cost of goods in the conventional sense and what the market will bear. And
Yeah.
so I agree with you. I love the analog of how do you kind of use AWS scale to reduce development costs. I think that's really smart. I'm a little less optimistic it's actually going to yield price point in the end, but it's the right approach, no question.
Well, I was going to say great segue into our last question, because we're coming up on our the end here, which is digital therapeutics, because a lot of what we're talking about, even Chris, in terms of what you said earlier about virtual care deserts, right? This emergence now of digital therapeutics, and this being a future metaverse similar to what Amazon became, and what's evolving for gaming as the next metaverse in media and entertainment. So each of your thoughts on digital therapeutics. Chris, do you want to start?
I mean, I'm happy to give an initial impression, and I'm not an expert here. Certainly, following firms like Pear and Click and Quit Genius, I think the observation I'd make is that to date, the use cases are pretty narrow, right? Smoking cessation, some depression, insomnia. I'm not saying these aren't conditions that warrant treatment, and I love the intersection of digital technology and payment, and in a way or in a form that the provider are accustomed to delivering a prescription, and there's a payment mechanism and a delivery form. I think that is a great cohesion of things that can come together to help really grow a market. I think they're going to have to, achieve or demonstrate that it can have more wide-ranging use cases beyond where we are today. But I think that's part of an evolving market, and I certainly look forward to watching that progression.
Francisco?
On one hand, I think about the fact that we know that, for example, social networks, right, can make us sad, right? And induce like depression and all these things. So there's a reason to believe that sort of neuromodulation can happen via the screen, which is effectively your second brain plugged into you. That said, the reimbursement profile is kind of strange right now and unproven. And I think it should be viewed as a tool in combination with so many other things, right? You could have the sort of digital therapeutic as a pure sort of what we think of as, screen-based, some kind of app-based intervention. But then we should be coupling that with, telehealth and telemedicine and possibly pharmaceutical. Like there should be a holistic sort of care model that the digital therapeutics do. It could just be that the digital therapeutics are just great for biomarkers. We were talking about SMI earlier. We can sort of measure that. MindStrong does that, right? By measuring your interactions with your screen to kind of like track patients and predict SMI outcomes. And so as it's defined before, I don't think the sort of drug prices at app costs is going to bear out, which was always the hope. But I do think that all of the stuff we're seeing right now is lending credence to the fact that we will have to use more sort of app-based sort of interventions with people as part of the whole suite of tools.
Dina?
Yeah, I know we're hitting up on the end of time here. So just to wrap on that point, I think, as we think about digital in the context of of therapeutics, I think we need to also think about diagnostics. And again, this goes back to different modes of care delivery, and sort of the blurring lines between care delivery and clinical innovation. I think there's been a lot more peer-reviewed research in this space and much more to come, and in particular for behavioral health and for obviously for imaging. There's been a lot going on to date, but to the extent we can bridge the technologies and create these platform plays for therapeutics, I think that there's still a lot more to be done there. We're just starting to see that in terms of reimbursements and traction and FDA approval. But at the end of the day, we need providers to actually prescribe these. And that's ultimately, I think, where some of the challenge will lie in behavior change.
On that note, thank you so much to our panelists, Dina, Francisco, Chris, and our audience for spending time today in this rich dialogue. Thank you so much. And Aaron, Judy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Chitra. This was such an interesting discussion, and all of you have very, very different backgrounds. It was really interesting to see how you agreed on a lot of issues. It's such a hot topic. I kind of feel like we're going to have a banner year again this year in terms of investment in digital health. So really, really appreciate all your perspectives.